Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, we draw close to the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, a village of neat hedges and curious hearts. Here begins Miss Marple and the Poison in the Village Well, a tale of still water, secret fears, and the fine art of listening. In this story, Miss Jane Marple, the gentle soul with eyes that miss nothing, sits once more amid her knitting and her thoughts. Around her, gossip flows as freely as tea, and beneath it, something darker stirs. A sickness in the village well has brought unease, and the calm of English respectability trembles at its edges. There will be no hurried revelations here, only quiet observation and the soft unfolding of truth. For Miss Marple knows that every mannerly smile hides a motive, and that innocence in a village is never quite what it seems. Let the hour be calm, the candle steady, and the listener attentive. The air carries both the fragrance of spring and the faint chill of mystery. Chapter 1. The Still Water of St. Mary. Mead morning light lay softly over St. Mary Mead. The hedges shone after a light rain, and the air felt clean. At the village green, the old stone well stood quiet, newly boarded and ringed with rope. A notice from the council warned against use, its ink still damp. Miss Jane Marple walked with a measured step along the path. Her scarf was pale blue, and her knitting bag bumped gently at her side. She paused before the well and folded her hands. Her eyes, kind but watchful, studied the boards and the rope knots without haste. Reverend Clement came up from the lane, hat in hand. He greeted her with a tired smile. His sermon notes poked from his pocket like a tidy fan. The village, he said, was uneasy. He hoped the council would test the water quickly. He asked if she had slept. "I slept," Miss Marple said. The village did not. At the corner by the green, Mrs. Price Ridley spoke with Miss Hartnell in short, brisk phrases. Their voices carried like dry leaves. They said the sudden illness was strange. They said a fever was one thing, but these symptoms were another. They said the well had never brought harm before. Dr. Haydock arrived with his bag and a furrowed brow. He looked at the boards, then at Miss Marple. He said the cases had puzzled him. He had seen dizziness, confusion, and odd dryness of the mouth. He did not like the pattern. It reminded him of something he could not yet name. Miss Marple nodded and asked about timing. The doctor frowned, then glanced at his notes. The first sick child had been seen 2 evenings ago. An older gentleman had fallen ill the following morning. A widow had complained of blurred vision yesterday afternoon. The sequence felt like ripples spreading. A light breeze turned the notice on its nail. The rope creaked along the wood. A pair of sparrows hopped on the green, busy with their small lives. Miss Marple watched them, then looked down at the base of the well. The earth there was dark, as if it had been wet for longer than the rain. Inspector Hewitt came in a sensible coat and stood with steady patience. He greeted each person in order. He asked for facts, not rumours. He said the council laboratory would send a man by afternoon. He asked that no one panic. Mrs. Price Ridley did not panic. She pronounced it a disgrace. She said the council should have acted the instant someone felt unwell. She said standards were slipping everywhere. Miss Hartnell nodded with an expression of thin approval. Miss Marple spoke only once, and quietly. She said that when one thing changes, many small things shift with it. She looked at the green. She looked at the path. She looked at the pump handle near the school railings. Then she looked back at the well. She asked if anyone had seen a lantern there late last evening. The Reverend shook his head. Mrs. Price Ridley said no with vigour. Miss Hartnell began to say yes, then changed her mind midway. She said perhaps she had mistaken a bicycle lamp on the lane. A cart rattled by with sacks of flour. The grocer's boy raised a hand. His fingers were stained with a faint green tinge, as if from new paint. He saw Miss Marple watching and tucked his hand into his pocket. He called that he would return with lemons for Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper herself crossed the green with small, careful steps. Her black dress was fresh pressed and a lace collar lay very neat. She thanked the doctor for visiting her yesterday. She said she felt much improved. She said the cordial she had made had helped her rest. Miss Marple's eyes warmed. She praised the comfort of a well-made cordial. She asked, as one lady might ask another, which herbs Mrs. Harper used. Mrs. Harper smiled at the question. She listed sugar, lemon, and a few garden leaves. She said the recipe had belonged to her mother. A cloud moved across the sun. The boards on the well dimmed to a dull grey. In the hush, the inspector explained that no one should draw water from the well. He asked households to boil water from other sources. He said the vicarage pump was to be checked within the hour. Miss Marple thanked him and walked to the low stone wall near the elm. She sat with care, smoothed her skirt, and took out her knitting. The needles clicked in a gentle rhythm. Her eyes moved between wool and world with an easy, friendly calm. First small clue, as she knitted, she noticed a thin, greenish stain beneath the lowest board. It traced a narrow line along the stone lip and down to the earth. Rain had not washed it away. It had dried in a strange, powdery crust that clung to the rough edge of the stone. Dr. Haydock excused himself and went to the vicarage. The Reverend followed with a ring of keys. The inspector took notes and made a little map of the green. He drew the well as a square and the ropes as 2 lines. He marked where each villager had stood. Miss Marple rose and drifted to the post office. She moved with the slow confidence of one who knows the measure of a village. She greeted the postmistress, who sorted letters with a precise, gentle touch. The bell chimed as the door closed. Inside, Miss Hartnell argued about the delay in the councilman's visit. The postmistress answered in kind tones. Deliveries had been late since the roadworks began. There had been talk of a subcontractor who lacked patience for village customs. Miss Marple listened and asked nothing more. She bought a penny stamp and left. Outside, the green felt quieter than before. Children had been kept home. The air held a faint smell of damp stone and crushed grass. A robin on the pump handle bobbed, then flew to the elm. Miss Marple returned to the well and stood very near. She made a show of looking at the rope. Her eyes looked lower. She studied the stone lip again. Her expression did not change. She thanked the inspector for his diligence and said she would be at home before luncheon. Second small clue. On the path to her cottage, she saw the grocer's boy again. He carried a crate with lemons and 2 bottles of tonic water. The same green smudge marked his knuckles. He brushed the crate against his trousers and hurried along. A fragment of paper fluttered from the crate, a delivery slip with a number. Miss Marple watched the paper settle by the hedge. She picked it up and tucked it into her bag with a simple nod. Then she went on, her face as mild as milk. Miss Marple's cottage welcomed her with the light scent of lavender polish. She set her knitting by the window and placed the delivery slip on the table. The number at the top did not belong to the grocer. It looked like a supplier number from the larger town beyond the hill. She made tea and let it steep. She sat down and with a small paper knife carefully lifted a corner of the stamp. There was a scribble of initials on the back, likely a clerk's habit. She replaced the stamp and smoothed it with a fingertip. She remembered Mrs. Harper's cordial and the neatness of her collar. She remembered the way Mrs. Harper had said garden leaves. The phrase sounded pretty and imprecise. Miss Marple had known many gardens and many leaves. Some soothed, some harmed, and some made the world swim in a haze. A knock sounded. Reverend Clement entered with a troubled face. The pump at the vicarage had tested clear. The inspector thought the issue centred on the well. The Reverend asked if she had any thoughts. He said the village looked to reason more than ever. Miss Marple poured tea and spoke gently. She asked after the list of those who had fallen ill. She asked him to mark the times upon a page. He did so with tidy strokes, the pen scratching in the quiet room. A pattern began to show like a faint path through grass. The first child had played marbles near the green after supper. The older gentleman had walked the square before breakfast. The widow had taken water for washing in the afternoon, though she lived near the lane. Each had been near the well within a narrow window after rain. Third, small clue, Miss Marple asked if anyone had seen a powder on the stone or smelled something bitter. The Reverend recalled a choir girl who said the stones looked frosted near the boards. He had thought it a fancy. He now wondered if she had seen residue left by careless hands. They drank their tea. The clock ticked in its kind way. Miss Marple felt the village in her bones. She felt the pull of small habits and the weight of small fears. She asked the Reverend about Mrs. Harper's late husband. He said the man had kept accounts for a builder. He had been respectable and quiet. The Reverend asked if the cordial worried her. Miss Marple said cordial was innocent if made with care. She added that care could be an affectation. A person might polish a table to hide the dust along its rim. A cordial might disguise a bitter leaf with sugar and lemon. There came another knock. Inspector Hewitt entered with his notebook tucked away. He said the councilman had arrived. He had taken samples and sealed them with red wax. He would send them to the laboratory by motor. Until then, all must be patient. Miss Marple nodded. She asked about the grocer's deliveries before the illness began. The inspector said a new supplier had been used for a fortnight. There had been a shortage. The grocer had taken what he could get. He said this with a steady face, but concern lived under the words. Miss Marple fetched the delivery slip. She placed it on the table. The inspector looked at the number. He said it matched the new supplier. He asked where she had found it. She said it had fluttered loose. She said the boy had green stains on his hands. She said she had seen the same stain upon the well. The inspector stood still for a moment. He wrote something slow and careful. He thanked her in a low voice. He said he would speak to the grocer and the boy in private. He asked if he might also ask Dr. Haydock about symptoms again. Miss Marple encouraged him to do so. She added that a plant could mimic an element in effect, though not in composition. She said dryness of mouth and confusion had a familiar ring. The doctor would know the shape of that ring, even if he did not yet name it. Fourth small clue. As the inspector left, Miss Marple noticed the Reverend's sleeve. A faint dust lay along the cuff, the same hard green cast. He laughed at her glance and said he had leaned against the well earlier. He had brushed the board out of habit, as one might straighten a picture. The dust had clung like chalk. Miss Marple's eyes warmed again. She asked the Reverend to change his coat and wash just to be safe. He obeyed with a good grace. She tidied the table and set out a fresh cloth. The room took on the air of a prepared mind. Afternoon light deepened. From the lane came the gentle clatter of a handcart. The postmistress paused at the gate with a bundle of envelopes. She had one for Miss Marple. It was from a retired governess in another parish. Inside was a leaflet about poisonous plants commonly misused in home tonics. It felt like chance, though chance often worked for the observant. Miss Marple read a line about belladonna and its common names. She traced the clean print with a fingertip. The symptoms aligned in a quiet chorus. She folded the leaflet and placed it beside the delivery slip. The two pieces sat together as if they had always belonged. She put on her hat and walked to the vicarage garden. The border of foxgloves stood tall and lovely. Belladonna lurked in a corner near the compost heap, its berries hidden under glossy leaves. The Reverend joined her and spoke of recent weeding. He said the gardener had been called away last week. Miss Marple bent and studied the soil near the belladonna. She saw a small patch of disturbed loam and a broken stem. She stood and smoothed her skirt. Her voice remained calm. She asked if anyone had borrowed a basket for gathering leaves. The Reverend said that Mrs. Harper had borrowed one on Tuesday. They returned to the lane. The inspector met them by the gate with the grocer's boy in tow. The boy looked pale but tried to stand straight. The inspector said the boy had delivered paint for the wellboards from the new supplier. The tins had leaked a little. He had wiped them with a rag and not washed before lifting crates. Miss Marple listened. Then she asked the boy where he had placed the rag. He said he had left it near the green behind the bench. The inspector made a note and sent a constable to fetch it. The boy asked if he was in trouble. The inspector said no, but truth mattered. Evening gathered along the hedges. Lamps lit in tidy windows. The village drew its curtains against worry and night. Miss Marple walked with the inspector to the green once more. The boards on the well looked dull and faithful. The rope lay quiet, but the stone lip still showed its thin crust of colour. Miss Marple spoke with care. Paint dust might mark a hand, but it did not sicken a village in this manner. Something else had met the water, something carried by leaves or by careless steeping. She said the village would need courage for the next days. She said courage was often nothing more than attention held steady. The inspector thanked her again. He said the laboratory would tell them more by morning. He would question Mrs. Harper with kindness but firmness. He would ask about recipes and gardens. He would ask about an old debt whispered at the post office. Miss Marple turned toward home. She thought about kindness as she walked. Kindness could be genuine or could be a veil. People poured cordial for friends and for the quieting of conscience. They cleaned a collar to face the world with order. They held a cup steady when their hearts beat fast. She reached her gate and paused. The night smelled of damp stone and faint flowers. She listened to the village breathing behind its curtains. She thought of the sparrows at the green, busy with life, while danger stirred at their feet. She felt no fear, only steady purpose. She lit her lamp and sat with her knitting once more. Each stitch found its place. The clock marked the hour. She laid out the leaflet, the delivery slip, and a blank page. She wrote a neat list of times, names, and small signs. She paused after each line to ask if it rang true. Her list grew like a path across a field. At the end, she left a space, as if for a name not yet written. She folded the page and set it under a china dish. Then she closed her eyes for a moment and saw the well again. She saw the thin crust upon the stone. She saw a hand steadying a basket near the lip. She opened her eyes and smiled, a gentle, almost grandmotherly smile. She would wait. She would listen. She would be ready when truth spoke in its small domestic voice. The village would go on with its tea and its tidying. Under that neat surface, the current would carry her toward the thing itself. Chapter 2. The Widow's Cup. The vicarage garden dressed itself in Sunday calm. Early light lay on the trimmed lawns and the neat beds of herbs. Cups clinked on saucers. Voices moved with the reassurance of manners. Mrs. Harper stood near the table with a glass jug of cordial. She wore a pale blouse and a dark skirt, the collar smooth and exact. She poured with careful hands. The liquid shone like pale amber in the sun. Miss Marple sat in a wicker chair beside a pot of thyme. Her knitting lay folded on her lap. She watched the gathering with the fond interest of a village aunt. No detail escaped her eye, though nothing in her manner pressed. Reverend Clement welcomed neighbours at the gate. Mrs. Price Ridley took a seat and surveyed the spread with brisk approval. Miss Hartnell nodded at everything, as if her head worked by a spring. Dr. Haydock arrived with an air of practical concern and set his case beneath a chair. The talk turned to the sealed well and the men from the council. The Reverend spoke of patience and common sense. Inspector Hewitt appeared by the hedge and joined them with a polite nod. He asked that everyone boil water and keep to trusted sources. Mrs. Harper offered him cordial. He thanked her and took only a small measure. He said he was on duty, and he preferred a clear head. Mrs. Harper smiled and said a little sweetness steadied the nerves. Her smile held, bright and fixed, like a ribbon pinned too tightly. Miss Marple accepted a thimble of the cordial. She raised the glass to her nose without fuss. The scent of lemon came first. Under it lay a green note, delicate and slightly dull. She sipped and let the taste settle. Sugar, citrus, and a ghost of something that did not belong. A group of choir children paused by the herb border. They whispered about the well and the boards and the rope. The Reverend shooed them kindly toward the bunting and the sponge cakes. Their small feet pattered across the grass like sparrow wings. Mrs. Harper moved from guest to guest with friendly gravity. She inquired after health and sleep. She spoke of how grief had taught her the value of small comforts. She said, making cordial calmed the mind and gave the hands good work. She said her mother had believed in simple remedies. Miss Marple set down her glass and asked about the recipe. She spoke lightly, like one woman passing a kitchen secret to another? She asked when the cordial had been made and where it had been stored. Mrs. Harper answered at once. She said Tuesday morning in her scullery and on the cool shelf behind the bread tin. Dr. Haydock tasted a drop and frowned. He said it was pleasant enough. He said he preferred tea for his practice. He asked whether the lemons had come from the grocer. Mrs. Harper said yes with a small, bright nod. The inspector stood still, watching the light move across the tablecloth. He asked nothing. He seemed to prefer the leisure of listening. His gaze touched Miss Marple for a moment and then moved away again. A breeze travelled through the garden. The thyme released a clean aroma. The sun played on the glass jug. Mrs. Harper refilled a small glass for herself. Her hand trembled faintly. The glass chimed against the jug lid. She steadied it and put the glass down untouched. Miss Marple smiled and asked about Mrs. Harper's roses. She said roses asked much but repaid the effort. The widow lit with gratitude and spoke warmly of pruning and mulch. In speaking of roses, her hands grew steady. A maid from the vicarage carried out a tray of seed cakes. The maid set the tray down and brushed a crumb from her apron. She glanced at the jug with a private curiosity, then looked away when she saw Miss Marple watching her with kind interest. The choir children made a ring near the hedge and practised a hymn. Their voices rose sweetly and then faltered in the higher line. Reverend Clement praised their effort and promised lemonade at the end. He did not promise cordial. A robin alighted on the edge of a watering can. It tilted its head and then darted to the thyme pot. Miss Marple watched it with pleasure. She noticed how the bird rejected the damp rim of the watering can and chose the dry edge of the pot. She turned back to the table. The cordial had a faint clouding now that the sun warmed it. The warmth drew up a smell like crushed leaves after rain. The scent was subtle and would pass most noses without notice. A small clue came quietly. Miss Marple touched the outside of the jug. Her fingertips found a fine chalk on the glass near the handle. She rubbed her finger and saw a pale green dust along the skin, as if the jug had rested near a powder. She wiped her finger on her handkerchief and folded the cloth away. Mrs. Price Ridley asked the inspector about the laboratory. He said the sample had gone by motor and would reach the city this morning. He did not promise a time. He said he disliked guesses. He preferred facts placed side by side. Miss Hartnell said facts were never as interesting as gossip. She smiled to soften the words. The Reverend said gossip was like wind, useful to dry laundry and dangerous to carry sparks. Miss Marple agreed. She said gossip often hid fact in plain sight. Mrs. Harper took up her own glass. She raised it toward Miss Marple in a small salute. She lowered it again without drinking. Her throat worked, and a look passed over her face like a shadow, there and gone. She set the glass carefully on the table. Miss Marple asked how the widow was sleeping. Mrs. Harper said she slept well enough. She said she used a few drops of something the doctor had given her when her husband died. She said she used it rarely and never without care. Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. He asked which bottle she had kept. She named a mild sedative. He nodded. He said it was harmless when taken as directed. He said it would not trouble her heart or mind if she kept to a small dose. The choir finished their hymn and scattered to the cakes. The maid poured lemonade into thick tumblers. The maid avoided the jug of cordial when she could. She filled one glass of cordial for Mrs. Price Ridley with dutiful precision and handed it over with an expression that did not like the task. Miss Marple asked the maid how her mother's rheumatism was. The girl brightened and spoke of hot compresses and liniment. She said the vicar's wife had lent a book about herbs. The girl said she would return it as soon as she had finished the chapter on nightshade. The inspector looked up at that word. He did not speak. His attention sharpened in the way of a man who sees a thread end on a carpet and wonders where it leads. A second quiet clue appeared. Miss Marple followed the maid's glance toward a shelf by the scullery door. A small smear stained the wood near a row of empty bottles. The smear had the same green tint as the powder on the jug. It lay as if a thumb had pressed it there without thought. Mrs. Harper began to speak about gratitude and friendship. Her voice was low and well-shaped. She thanked the vicarage for the gathering. She said kindness held a village together. She looked at Miss Marple and smiled as if to say she knew who among them truly saw. Miss Marple returned the smile. She asked what Mrs. Harper planned to plant this season. The widow said thyme, rosemary, and mint. She said mint soothed summer headaches. She said she had pulled up a patch of unruly belladonna that had grown near her back fence. She said she had burned the stalks so they would not spread. The inspector asked when she had done the burning. Mrs. Harper said last week after rain. She said the smoke had been unpleasant. She said she had been careful. Dr. Haydock mentioned that belladonna was a thing to be handled with respect. He said its beauty hid trouble. He said any rashness with such a plant might end in confusion and worse. He looked at the jug and fell silent. The garden grew warmer. Bees visited the thyme. A hoverfly hung over the rim of the jug, then drifted away as if the scent did not promise sweetness. Miss Marple watched this small refusal and placed it gently among her thoughts. The maid brought a small tin of biscuits. She set it near the cordial and caught her sleeve on the jug handle. The jug knocked lightly against the lip of a glass and made a sound that seemed too bright in the mild air. The girl murmured an apology and moved away. The party thinned as church time approached. Mrs. Price Ridley took a final sip of cordial and announced a faint taste of garden. She declared it rustic. She said town people would not understand country flavour. Miss Hartnell agreed and reached for another biscuit. Inspector Hewitt drifted to Miss Marple's chair. He clasped his hands and looked at the time. He said the laboratory might confirm what the doctor suspected. He said the pattern did not fit any common infection. He said he had questions for the widow, but would ask them kindly. Miss Marple said kindness and firmness were cousins. She said most people responded to one or the other. She asked if he had noticed the jug handle. He said he had. He asked if she had noticed the shelf by the scullery. She said she had. They shared a small silence in which agreement needed no words. The inspector moved away to speak to the maid. Miss Marple rose and walked the garden's edge, pausing as if to admire the roses. Her eyes took in the gate, the tool shed, and the ash bin near the fence. She saw a basket resting upside down against the shed wall. Its rim bore a pale green ring, as if dust had settled and been pressed by a hand. She lifted the basket and set it down. Inside lay 2 sprigs of dried leaf, brittle and dark. She did not touch them. She closed the basket and returned it to its place. A third clue folded itself into the day. The ash bin held a small mound of grey with darker streaks. The streaks suggested stems that had not burned to nothing. A faint scent rose when the breeze shifted. It did not smell like common wood ash. It smelled like plant smoke with a bitter undernote. Miss Marple rejoined the table. Mrs. Harper stood alone for a moment, her posture careful in its grace. Miss Marple asked if she could help carry the jug inside. The widow thanked her and lifted it herself with a steadying breath. Miss Marple followed to the scullery door and looked in with mild curiosity. Shelves held neat rows of jars. A stack of clean cloths lay beside the bread tin. On the second shelf, a stoneware bottle sat with a new cork. Its label had been torn away, leaving a ragged edge. Miss Marple did not stare. She let her gaze pass over it and fall to the floor instead. She noticed a faint ring on the scrubbed boards where the jug had rested recently. The ring had a thin green sheen at one point, like the dried edge of a spill. She drew back and thanked the widow again for her kindness. She returned to the garden with a look of content that hid its purpose. Dr. Haydock collected his case. He said he would visit the 2 patients again before evening. He asked Mrs. Harper whether she had delivered any cordial to neighbours. She said she had taken a small bottle to Mrs. Price Ridley on Friday. She said she had given the maid a spoonful when the girl felt light-headed yesterday. The maid confirmed the spoonful with a shrug. She said it had tasted bitter under the sugar. She said it had cleared the light-headedness quickly, which seemed odd to her. The doctor thanked her and told her to drink water and eat before work. Miss Marple asked the inspector if he might walk with her to the lane. He agreed at once. They strolled beneath the hedge and paused where the path narrowed. Miss Marple spoke in a tone that could not be overheard. She said the cordial held a whisper of belladonna. She said the powder on the jug and shelf looked the same as the crust on the well-stone. She said the ashbin told a story of hasty burning, and the basket told of leaves gathered without enough care. The inspector listened with respect. He asked whether the widow could have poisoned the well deliberately. Miss Marple said the well's contamination might be a careless consequence. She said a person might empty a pot of steeped leaves into a drain that led to the green. She said a person might wash a jug beside the well and spill residue upon the stone. He asked why a person would do any of this. She said people act from a knot of reasons. She said grief and fear can braid with money and pride. She said a debt mentioned in a letter could tighten the knot until judgment frayed. The inspector nodded. He said he would ask about debts. He said he would trace the supplier number and the grocer's recent shifts. He said he would speak with the laboratory as soon as the results came. They returned to the garden. Mrs. Harper had begun to collect plates. Her movements were balanced and gentle, yet once she placed a plate slightly off-center. She looked at it, corrected it, and then looked about as if the small error had revealed too much. Her face regained its practiced serenity. Miss Marple offered to walk home with her. The widow agreed. They left by the side gate and followed the lane past low walls and sleepy hedges. The air felt cooler away from the cluster of voices. Birds rustled in the leaves with small, busy sounds. They spoke of simple things. Miss Marple admired the widow's garden. She asked about the soil and the compost heap. She complimented the tidy border and the neatness of the stepping stones. Mrs. Harper received these remarks with gratitude. Her voice warmed around the details her hands knew. At the cottage gate, Mrs. Harper paused. She invited Miss Marple for a short visit. Miss Marple accepted at once. They entered a parlour plain and scrupulously clean. The clock ticked with patient dignity. A photograph of Mr. Harper stood on the mantel, his expression mild and uninformative. The widow brought 2 small cups of tea. She added lemon with a steady spoon. She watched Miss Marple in the way one watches a person known to see too much. Miss Marple sipped and praised the tea. She let the silence rest for a moment. Another clue surfaced with domestic ease. Miss Marple saw a faint stain on the doily under the bread tin. It had dried in a pattern like a shallow ring. The stain showed a tide mark of green along one edge. It suggested a jug set down in haste after a spill. The doily had been turned, but the ring still ghosted through. Miss Marple spoke of memory. She said the village remembered Mr. Harper kindly. She said grief could make days blur and tasks go astray. She said a person might forget which shelf held safe bottles and which held risky ones. She said such confusion could happen to anyone. Mrs. Harper smoothed her skirt. She said Mr. Harper had been a good man. She said he had kept books for a builder who sometimes missed his payments. She said bills had gone unpaid during the winter. She said the builder had promised to make it right. Miss Marple nodded. She asked whether the builder had made it right. The widow hesitated and then said not yet. She said she did not like to complain. She said she managed on careful economies. She said the cordial recipe helped her sell a few jars at the Friday market. Miss Marple praised industry. She praised courage. She asked whether the market inspector had approved the labels. Mrs. Harper said he had glanced at them and said they looked neat. She said no one had fallen ill from her cordial. She said she would never allow harm. The clock ticked on. The room held the quiet of 2 women who understood the weight of small choices. Miss Marple set down her cup and folded her hands. She said in a gentle voice that certain leaves in a garden were not for cordial. She said their juice could make a person dizzy and dry of mouth. She said the scent could cling to a jug and drift upon steam. She said a little could pass for nothing until it reached a child. Mrs. Harper bowed her head. Her hands lay calm on her lap. She asked if Miss Marple thought her wicked. Miss Marple said no. She said she thought her human. She said fear and pride could combine into poor judgment. She said such judgment could be mended by truth spoken in time. The widow's eyes shone and then steadied. She said she had pulled up the belladonna and burned it. She said she had steeped some leaves by mistake while trying to make a stronger tonic. She said the smell had seemed wrong. She said she had poured the pot down the outside drain to be rid of it. Miss Marple asked, which drain? Mrs. Harper said the one that ran to the ditch by the green. She said she had not thought where it led in the sodden ground after rain. She said she had rinsed the jug at the well because the scullery tap coughed and spat rust. The final clue settled like a true note miss. Marple breathed in and out. She kept her voice calm. She said the laboratory would confirm what Dr. Haydock already suspected. She said the inspector would be kinder now than he would be later. She said it would be wise to tell him everything before the rumor grew. Mrs. Harper closed her eyes and then opened them. She said she would speak to the inspector. She said she had not meant to harm anyone. She said she had only wanted to make a tonic that sold well. She said she had wanted to pay the bill and keep her cottage neat and safe. Miss Marple touched the widow's hand, a light, steady touch. She said courage was the most domestic of virtues. She said courage wore an apron more often than armor. She said courage meant owning a mistake when the village's eyes felt sharp. They walked back to the vicarage garden together. The inspector waited by the gate, as if he had known the direction of truth and had stepped aside to let it walk. Mrs. Harper stood before him with an upright grace that had no pride left in it. She spoke in a level voice. She told him about the leaves and the pot. She told him about the drain and the well. She told him about the jug and the shelf. She named the builder and the unpaid bill without once asking for pity. The words came clean and plain. The inspector listened without interruption. He wrote only a few lines. He said the laboratory would speak to the composition, but the account fitted the pattern. He said no one had died and that mattered. He said the doctor would attend to those still unwell. He said the council would clean the well and test again. Dr. Haydock joined them and offered the widow a glass of water. She drank and her hands steadied. Miss Marple stood to one side and watched the garden resume its quiet. The thyme breathed. The robin returned to the watering can and accepted a drink. The inspector said there might still be questions about the timing. He said he would check the drain and the ditch with the councilman. He said the builder would answer for his bill in another office. He said the village would be told only what it needed to know. Mrs. Harper thanked him. She said she would help in any way. She said she would destroy her cordial and her labels. She said she would plant roses this year and leave the nightshade to the hedgerows. Miss Marple walked home along the lane with the soft satisfaction of a task halfway done. She knew that truth was often a mosaic, with each piece dull on its own and shining together. She knew there might still be a missing tessera. She would watch for it in the ordinary hours. At her cottage table, she wrote a short note. She asked the postmistress to send for a pamphlet on household poisons. She folded the note and set it beside a slice of seed cake. The cake tasted of nutmeg and care. The afternoon light rested on the neat room. She lifted her knitting and began a new row. Each stitch laid order upon order. She thought of the jug. The morning began with a hush that did not suit St. Mary Mead. A grey sky pressed low, and the air smelled faintly of soap and iron. At the post office, a small crowd gathered under the awning. Letters, newspapers, and words changed hands together. Miss Hartnell stood near the counter, her umbrella resting against her sensible shoes. She spoke briskly to anyone who would listen. She said the well water had turned a curious shade of green when the boards were lifted for inspection. She said it looked like tarnished glass and smelled wrong. Mr. Davies, the grocer, stood behind her with a parcel of flour. He said the colour came from moss, nothing more. He said water could play tricks after rain. He said London scientists like to invent drama. He said the village must carry on. Miss Marple entered quietly, her expression mild. She greeted the postmistress, who smiled as though nothing about the morning felt ordinary. Miss Marple waited her turn with a small basket over her arm. Inside lay a skein of pale wool and a folded letter for a friend in Market Basing. The postmistress sorted stamps. her hands neat and precise. Miss Hartnell's voice carried over the counter like the peal of a small bell. She said Mrs. Harper had fainted again the night before. She said the doctor had called it exhaustion. She said it was the same sort of exhaustion that followed guilt. Mr. Davies grunted but said nothing. He studied his parcel. Miss Marple looked at him kindly and asked whether his deliveries had improved. He said there had been confusion about a supplier. He said the last batch of tonic water had come sealed in green bottles instead of clear. He said it looked foreign and not quite right. Miss Marple thanked him. She asked whether the same supplier provided paint for the wellboards. Mr. Davies said he thought so. He said the paint came by train from the same warehouse. He said it had a green label with gold lettering. He said he had not thought of it before. A small clue slipped into place. Miss Marple asked whether the warehouse name began with M. He frowned and said perhaps. He said the paperwork had blurred after rain. He said the grocer's boy had left it behind in his bicycle basket. He said the councilman had taken it away when he came to inspect the well. Miss Marple thanked him again. Her voice stayed even, yet her eyes were quietly busy. She looked around the post office. Mrs. Price Ridley entered with her hat slightly askew. She carried a basket full of laundry and an air of firm purpose. She said the council's man had found traces of something in the well, though he would not say what. She said it was chemical. She said chemical things had no business near the water of honest people. She said standards were falling. The postmistress nodded but said nothing. She tied string around a parcel with great care. Her eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, who smiled back as if to say she understood the language of careful silence. Miss Marple asked gently about Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Price Ridley said the widow had stayed home this morning. She said the woman looked pale as chalk and hardly spoke. She said grief had worn thin and something else had taken its place. Miss Marple said nothing at all. She thanked the postmistress, bought a halfpenny stamp, and tucked her letter into the basket. She stepped outside into the thin rain. The lane smelled of wet soil and smoke. She walked toward the green. The well still stood, roped off, the boards damp and stained. A small pool of water glimmered near the base. It looked green indeed, like an old bottle's shadow. Miss Marple leaned on her umbrella and watched the water for a long moment. She saw that the colour changed when the wind passed. It deepened and then thinned again. She stepped closer and saw the faint track of a boot sole leading from the puddle toward the lane. The track had a cross pattern, likely from a man's working shoe. Another quiet clue arrived with the rain. She bent and touched the edge of the board. The wood felt damp, almost oily. The smell was faintly sweet, with a bitter trace beneath. She knew that scent from her garden shed, where she kept plant tinctures and small bottles of oil for cleaning scissors. The Reverend approached from the lane, his coat pulled close. He greeted her warmly and said the inspector had come again. He said the samples from the well were under review. He said the laboratory would know more within the day. Miss Marple asked if they had taken soil as well as water. He said yes. He said the inspector thought something had seeped from the ditch. He said the councilman had mentioned residue near the drain. She nodded. She asked if the drain lay near Mrs. Harper's garden. He said it did, just beyond her compost heap. He said he had never noticed it connected to the green. He said water often found its own way. The Reverend sighed and looked at the roped well. He said the village must not lose its sense of proportion. He said fear could spread faster than sickness. He said people must stay kind. Miss Marple agreed. She said kindness was always the first cure, though not always the last. She said truth needed gentleness to be heard. She left him there, hat in hand, looking at the water that shimmered like false jade in the grey light. At home she made tea and opened her notebook. She wrote in small, neat lines, green water. Supplier label with M drain near Harper Garden. Powder on jug and shelf. She paused, then added one more line. Gossip may hide evidence. She smiled as she wrote it. In St. Mary Mead, gossip was as natural as breathing. It was also a kind of mirror. People revealed themselves while pretending to talk about others. The rain cleared by afternoon. Miss Marple walked to the grocer's shop for bread. The bell above the door rang softly. Mr. Davies looked up and nodded. He said the inspector had taken his ledger to check invoices. He said it was a bother, but he had nothing to hide. Miss Marple said honesty always sounded like that, a quiet inconvenience. She chose a loaf, then asked whether any of the green bottles had been returned. He said 2 were still in the back room. He fetched one and set it on the counter. The glass was tinted pale green. A faint residue clung to the rim. Miss Marple held it up to the light. The colour shifted slightly toward blue. She asked if the bottle had ever held tonic or cordial. Mr. Davies said tonic, but he had rinsed it himself. He said it had smelled slightly of herbs before the rinse. She thanked him and left, her thoughts steady. The street smelled of coal smoke and violets. She passed the school where children recited their lessons with uneven rhythm. At the end of the lane, Mrs. Harper's cottage waited behind its tidy fence. Miss Marple paused by the gate. The garden looked restful. The roses had been pruned to disciplined shapes. The compost heap sat under a tarpaulin. Beside it, the ground dipped toward the ditch. She saw faint footprints in the damp earth, lighter now, but still visible. Another clue waited in the quiet earth. She looked closer and saw a single dried leaf caught in the fence wire. It was dark, crumpled, and spotted with a green powder. She touched it lightly with a gloved hand. The smell that rose was familiar again, sweet at first, bitter beneath. She placed the leaf inside her notebook and closed it. Then she turned toward the lane. The inspector met her halfway. He looked tired but resolute. He said the laboratory report had come. The well water contained traces of belladonna. He said the quantity was small but unmistakable. He said the village could rest easy, that no one would die. Miss Marple nodded. She asked whether he had told Mrs. Harper. He said not yet. He said he preferred to confirm every fact before alarm spread. He said he meant to call on her before dusk. She offered to join him. He hesitated, then agreed. They walked together toward the cottage. The light softened, and a blackbird sang from the hedge. The sound carried like comfort in a world uncertain of itself. Mrs. Harper received them in her doorway. Her dress was neat, her face pale but calm. The inspector asked if she had been feeling stronger. She said yes. She said she had been thinking of planting sweet peas. She said the air felt clean after rain. She lowered her gaze. She said she had destroyed her cordial and cleaned her shelves. She said her garden would grow herbs of harmless virtue this year. She said she had slept a little, and the sleep had been kind. The doctor asked to see the scullery. She led the way without a word. The shelves were neat. A single stoneware bottle remained, corked, label torn away. He touched nothing. He looked at the floorboards, scrubbed pale and damp at the edges. He asked when she last washed the jug used for cordial. She said Thursday. She said the scullery tap had coughed rusty water. She said she had carried the jug to the well because she had wanted the water to run clear. She said she had not thought beyond that need. He looked at her hands. A faint green shadow lived near her cuticle, almost gone. He asked whether she had worn gloves while burning the belladonna. She said she had not. She said she had believed the smoke would wash her hands clean of it. He said little. He thanked her for her candour. He told her to rest and to eat. On his way back to the surgery, he met Miss Marple again. She had a leaflet about household poisons in her basket. She said the publisher had sent it from another parish. She said such materials often arrived when needed. He smiled despite himself. He said coincidence often favoured the persistent. He asked if she had noticed anything new at the vicarage. She said a ring on the flag and the smell of thyme in the towel. She added that a robin had chosen the dry rim of the watering can again. He took that in. He said robins were better doctors than most. They both smiled. Afternoon folded itself neatly over the village. Dr. Haydock returned to his surgery and sat at his desk. He laid the vial with the glass splinter beside the green smeared slip. He uncapped his pen and wrote a sentence that steadied his mind. The pattern is consistent with belladonna taken by mouth and by water. He paused. He wrote another line. 2 introductions to poison appear. One is careless rinsing. One is deliberate serving. He disliked that second phrase and yet could not strike it. He pressed the blotter gently over the ink and waited. The nurse brought a notebook from the waiting area. A boy had left it behind after his mother's visit. The doctor flipped it open and found a list of dares written in childish hand. Drink tonic like father. Touch the well rope. Be brave at the green, he sighed. He closed the book and set it aside for return. He asked the nurse to fetch the next patient. No one waited. The village had chosen rest for the hour. He took up his ledger and turned to the week's prescriptions. Drops of tincture of belladonna were not among them. He kept such things under lock and seldom used them. His key lay in his pocket, heavy with promise and restraint. Third small Clue pad of receipt papers sat on the edge of the desk. The top leaf had been torn away along a ragged line. He had not made a receipt that morning. He lifted the pad and found a faint transfer of numerals on the leaf below, as if someone had written hard and torn the top. He breathed in and out once. He rang for the nurse. He asked if anyone had entered the surgery when he stepped next door to the chemist. She said yes, the grocer's boy had returned a ledger and asked to wait. She had gone to fetch bandages. He had left before she returned. The doctor sat very still. He remembered the boy's green-stained hands. He remembered the boy's neat cap and nervous eyes. He remembered the slight smell of fresh paint and crushed leaf when the boy had stood too close. Miss Marple arrived again, as if called by the weight of thought. She carried a small paper parcel. Inside lay a dried leaf caught in a fence wire. She set it on the blotter. The doctor did not touch it. He looked, and then he looked at her. He said he had found a torn page in the receipt pad. He said the boy had been in the room. He said he did not wish to climb the hill of accusation without more ground underfoot. She said care was wisdom, and wisdom was slow. She asked whether the pad could transfer letters if shaded. He passed her a pencil. She slid a thin sheet over the pad and drew the pencil flat. Characters rose from the paper like faint ghosts. A number appeared. A date, a single word written awkwardly as if copied. The word read cordial. They sat together and breathed. The nurse came and went with tea. Cups steamed harmlessly. The room held the kind reassurance of routine, while trouble made a map upon the desk. Inspector Hewitt entered without noise. He removed his hat and took in the scene. The doctor explained in plain language. He showed the vial with the glass splinter. He showed the smeared slip. He pointed to the shaded word. The inspector asked if the boy had been associated with the new supplier. The doctor said yes. The boy had carried paint tins and tonic crates. He had delivered lemons and returned the ledger. He had apologized for late notices and missed stamps. The inspector said the boy might be a messenger for another hand. He said boys often learned loyalty early and used it badly. He said he would speak to the boy with care. Miss Marple asked for a moment alone with the inspector by the window. They stood within sight of the desk, but out of the nurse's hearing. She spoke quietly. She said the boy had good intentions and poor guidance. She said another voice had told him what to say and when to stand near. The inspector asked whose voice. She said the village would offer 2 or 3 at once. She said truth would select one if asked the right gentle questions. They returned to the desk. The doctor felt the dilemma move within him like a slow tide. He must warn the village without shaming it. He must protect the boy if he could. He must name a pattern before rumor named a better story. He reached for the bell pull and stopped halfway. He looked at Miss Marple. She shook her head with the smallest movement. She said the right order of steps would steady all feet upon that floor. He lowered his hand. He said he would write a notice for Reverend Clement to read at supper hour. Boil all water. Accept no homemade tonics. For any faintness, dryness, or confusion at once. Seek the doctor before sleep if the eyes seem strange. Fourth, small clue. Before he could begin, the postmistress arrived with a brown envelope. She apologized for the hour. She said a letter addressed to the doctor had come from the city laboratory faster than expected. He took it and thanked her. He opened it and unfolded the page. The analysis named belladonna in the well water, but it added another line. Traces of a sweetener not common in household syrup, a saccharine compound used in a certain brand of tonic. He read it twice. He looked up. He said the cordial had been sweetened in the old way with sugar. The tonic carried a modern sweet taste. The gentleman had taken tonic on Thursday night. The boy had delivered it. The bottle in the grocer's back room had carried a faint herb smell. Miss Marple said a second hand had learned to mask bitterness with science while the widow used sugar. She said 2 mistakes walked the same road. She said their footprints confused the dust. The inspector set his hat on the desk and asked for the empty tonic bottle from the gentleman's house. The doctor opened a drawer and brought out the vial with the glass splinter. The inspector nodded. He said a matching rim shard might still sit in the gentleman's dustbin. They moved with quiet purpose through the rest of the afternoon. The inspector visited the gentleman and found a bottle in the bin with a chip missing. The chip fit the doctor's splinter, as if it had been born for that one place. The label on the bottle named the new supplier. The cap smelled faintly of herbs. The boy sat on a bench outside the grocer's, twisting his cap. The inspector sat beside him and spoke without heat. He asked who had told him to rinse bottles quickly and not fuss. The boy looked at his shoes. He said a man at the warehouse had laughed at village ways and told him speed was money. He asked who had told him to wipe a green label clean with a rag rather than wash it. The boy said the same man. He said the man had called him clever when he worked fast. He said he had wanted to keep the job. The inspector asked whether he had given cordial to anyone. The boy flushed and shook his head. He said no. He said he had tasted it once and disliked the bitter undernote. He said he had poured his mouthful into the hedge and hoped no one had seen. Miss Marple looked at his hand as he wrote a date. The capitals rose proud. The loops closed sharply. The hand matched the fragments more closely than anyone's yet. His mouth tightened when she asked whether he had written to Mr. Harper before his death. He said he had written often. He said the man had been just in accounts and stern in tone. She asked whether he had asked the widow for patience. He said yes. He said he had promised a settlement when a London client paid. He said the client had delayed. He said a small bridge job had cost more than expected. He said life was difficulty. The inspector spoke then. He said a letter had been partly burned in the widow's hearth. He said the phrases within hinted at silence and settlement. He said the writer had not signed it. He said the seal had been meant to impress. He watched the builder's eyes rather than his mouth. The builder's gaze went to the right, then down. He said he had tried to calm a gossiping partner last week. He said the partner had wanted to ask the widow for lenience. He said he had discouraged it. He said his partner had liked to play at importance with wax and paper. Miss Marple asked for the partner's name. He gave it with obvious reluctance. A broker who arranged small jobs. The broker drank tea with Mrs. Weatherby after choir. The broker admired tidy hands and noticed little stains. They found the broker at the tea room by the square. He rose with a smile too quick to be easy. He offered them seats and praise for the village's calm. He called the inspector wise and Miss Marple discerning. He buttered his role with care. The inspector asked about letters. The broker admitted to having drafted a note. He said he had meant to soothe the widow. He said he had regretted the phrases once written. He said he had torn it and thrown it into his grate. He said the wind had carried the pieces out when he lifted the pan. Miss Marple asked about sealing wax. He said he had used a stick kept for invitations. He said seals gave weight to words. He said people respected seals. He said it was harmless show. She asked whether he had walked past the widow's cottage last night. He said yes. He had taken the long way home. He had paused at her gate and considered knocking. He had thought better of it. He had walked on with a clear conscience. She looked at his cuffs. A faint green dust lay in the seam. She looked at his thumb. A small nick showed in the skin. She looked at his pocket. The corner of a paper bore the ghost of an anchor, as if a wet letter had lain against the lining. He saw her glance and smiled with his mouth only. He said the village had become obsessed with trifles. He said one must not lose proportion. He said good taste required forgetting small mistakes. Miss Marple's voice was gentle when she answered. She said good taste sometimes resembled good manners while hiding something mean. She said forgetting was a virtue only after truth had been spoken. The inspector took the man's name and promised to return. They stepped into the square's light. Bells marked the hour. The village looked almost washed clean. Miss Marple spoke quietly. She said the letter had sought to silence the widow, to make her delay a lawful debt. It had dressed itself in borrowed age and borrowed wax. It had not been posted because it had been an instrument, not a message. When the inspector's notice spread through the village, the letter had become dangerous. He asked who burned it. She said the hand that feared discovery and loved appearances. She said that hand had collected a pretty sheet, found a seal with a flattering initial, and written with a firm stroke meant to impress. She said that hand had not understood how ash holds memory. They walked back to the widow's gate. Evening settled like calm cloth. Mrs. Harper stood on the step with a shawl around her shoulders. She looked steadier than morning. The inspector told her the fragments were safe. He told her the debt would be addressed by the proper office. He told her that no private notes would press upon her door again. Miss Marple added only that the village would return to small things. Seed cake, hymns, pruning roses. She said that a letter never sent had done its work all the same. It had shown how easily a polite tone could be bent to unkind ends. The widow thanked them. She said she felt lighter. She said she would sleep with both windows open. She said clean air seemed a form of truth. Miss Marple returned home by the green. The well stood at rest, ropes quiet, boards drying. The air held the mild scent of rain on stone. She paused and listened to the hum of evening, that soft chorus of ordinary life. At her table, she wrote a final line for the day. Letter as mask, not message. Then she folded the page and slid it under her dish. She drew the lamp nearer and took up her knitting. The needles made their soft, homely music. Her thoughts flowed with the yarn, calm and precise. She felt the story settle into its next shape. Accidents clustered, but so did intentions. 2 poisons had walked the village lanes. One came from confusion and habit. The other came from vanity and pressure. Both had found water and words to carry them farther than their makers planned. She breathed, slow and even. The flame steadied. The cottage walls gathered the quiet. Outside, a robin settled on the hedge, choosing the dry twig, not the damp one. She nodded at the little wisdom and continued her row. Chapter 7. The Poisoner's Garden. Morning laid a gentle brightness over the vicarage lawn. Dew-pearls clung to every blade. The boarders stood still and attentive, like listeners at prayer. Miss Marple entered by the side gate with a small basket and an older patience. The garden had been shaped with care. Beds curved around the path in quiet confidence. Foxglove spires lifted their bells in orderly ranks. Near the far wall, darker leaves made a shadowed corner. The soil there looked rich and slightly bruised. Reverend Clement joined her with a smile that reached his eyes. He said the councilmen would return after luncheon. He said they would flush the drain again. He hoped that would satisfy the village. Then he asked after her health. "I am well," she said. "The garden is instructive." He looked at the tall foxgloves. He said beauty required discipline. He said weeds demanded the same energy as flowers. He said he sometimes mistrusted neatness when it stood too proud. Miss Marple nodded. She bent over the border and touched a leaf with one gentle finger. She named the plants as if greeting old neighbours. Thyme, sage, valerian, digitalis for the foxglove. Then she looked toward the dark corner and did not name it aloud. A robin hopped along the path and paused at the rim of a watering can. It tilted its head and chose a dry pebble instead. Miss Marple smiled with private approval and turned toward the compost heap. Dr. Haydock arrived with brisk steps and a thoughtful brow. He greeted them both and studied the borders with the care of a clinician reading a chart. He said the patients had improved overnight. He said the gentleman's vision no longer shimmered. He said the child asked for jam. Miss Marple asked whether their pupils had returned to normal. He said yes. He said the mouths were no longer dry. He said the heartbeats ran steady and modest. He looked relieved by those modest beats. Together they walked to the far corner. Belladonna grew there in a hush of shinier green. The berries had been cut away. Broken stems marked a recent struggle. The soil kept record of busy hands. Someone had pulled, then hesitated, then pulled again. Inspector Hewitt entered through the gate without ceremony. He paused to remove a small stone from his shoe and then joined them. He said the council had confirmed the drain's line beneath the path. He said the outlet met the ditch near the green. He said he would prefer not to think of drains again. Miss Marple said drains were only roads with water for travellers. She knelt and parted the leaves where the stems had broken. A faint, bitter scent rose, familiar as a lesson long learned. The broken ends had browned cleanly. A few drops had marked the soil like tea on linen. First quiet clue, she found a loose thread among the leaves. The thread was coarse and pale. It matched the vestry apron she had seen. A sticky trace clung to it, as if plant juice had glued it briefly to something rough and hurried. She folded it on her palm and stood. The Reverend looked at the thread. He said Mrs. Weatherby had borrowed the apron on Tuesday. She had returned it Wednesday afternoon. He had not inspected it. He felt a little ashamed of that small neglect. The inspector made a note and said shame often followed tidy people like a shadow. He asked if anyone else had been working in the corner. The Reverend said only the gardener before he was called away to help with his brother's farm. The corner had been left to its own counsel since. They moved back toward the centre bed. Foxgloves nodded as if answering a kindly question. Dr. Haydock paused beside one stalk and touched the bells lightly. He said his first memory of danger had been these flowers. He had watched a village child suck a thimble and fall ill. Miss Marple listened without interruption. She knew how memories teach better than warnings. She knew how warnings need memories to lend them weight. She looked toward the scullery window and then to the pump stone, where a pale ring still marked the place of some frequent rest. A breeze brought a cool shift in the air. The thyme answered with sweetness. The belladonna corner answered with a trace of something dry and polite. It was the sort of scent that would pass unnoticed among cakes and cordial, yet linger on a jug lip for hours. The inspector crouched by the path where it dipped toward the drain. He touched the edge with a pencil and lifted it again. A thin dust of green marked the wood. He said the colour repeated itself wherever care had come a little too late. Miss Marple looked at his pencil and said, repetition is sometimes confession set to a domestic rhythm. She asked the Reverend if anyone had borrowed a basket recently. He said yes, Mrs. Harper on Tuesday and then Mrs. Weatherby on Wednesday. Second quiet clue. Miss Marple examined the inside rim of the nearest basket, stacked by the shed. A faint green ring lay under the weave, pressed there by a weight of leaves. A single dried berry husk had lodged in a corner. She did not touch it. She looked until the inspector bent and saw it too. Dr. Haydock straightened and drew a careful breath. He said berries were more dramatic than leaves. He said they tempted untrained hands. He said a person might pick them thinking them easy to measure like currants. He said this with a sadness that belonged to medical practice. They walked the border in silence for a time. Bees went about their work. The garden breathed a kindly order that had not been broken by recent events. The village, for all its guilt and confusion, had not lost its appetite for buttered bread and brisk salutations. Miss Marple paused at the foxglove again. She traced the pattern of bells upon the stalk. She thought of digitalis and careful dosing. She thought of belladonna and blurred edges. She thought of arsenic dust pretending to be age. She thought of saccharine sweetness disguising tonic bitterness. She spoke softly. She said each poison admired a certain human trait. Arsenic admired tidiness. Belladonna admired vanity. A saccharine note admired speed. In that garden of traits, error germinated quickly, even under respectable hedges. The Reverend listened with humility. He said the garden had preached that sermon before, only he had not understood the language. He promised to learn his plants more than by their names. He looked at the belladonna corner as at a parishioner who had asked hard questions. Third quiet clue. Near the pump a strip of cloth lay caught under the flagstone edge. It had frayed into a narrow ribbon, stiff with drying. Miss Marple teased it free with a small twig. The weave matched Mrs. Harper's dishcloths. A pale sugar grain clung to one corner, caught in the sticky trace of leaf juice. She handed it to the inspector. He set it upon his notebook and stared at the path as if it might confess of its own accord. He said the garden had become a stage. Each actor had entered on cue. Each prop had waited where a hand had left it. Miss Marple's eyes softened. She said stages told the truth about audiences more than actors. She said the village had watched itself and learned its own nature. She said that lesson would last longer than the taste of fear. They sat on a bench beneath the pear tree. Sun warmed the wood. Ants travelled their busy routes along the cracked green paint. The inspector described the council's plan to cleanse the well with a thoroughness the parish would respect. The Reverend promised notices and good sense. Dr. Haydock stood to leave for his rounds. He required no thanks, yet thanks suited him. He accepted tea and turned his mind again to pulses and pupils. He looked once more toward the belladonna leaves and shook his head with a doctor's weary kindness. Miss Marple watched a hoverfly pause over the watering can and then drift toward a clean saucer set for birds. Choice, she thought, is the smallest wisdom. She rose from the bench and followed the path toward the shed. Afternoon brightened, mild and attentive. The shed door stood ajar, its hinges speaking softly. Inside, tools lived in plain order. A coil of twine hung beside a shelf of jars. The light slanted in and laid a narrow gold ladder on the floorboards. Miss Marple's gaze moved over each jar. Some held seeds labelled in the Reverend's hand. Some held nails meant for the next repair. One jar, at the far end of the shelf, held a cloudy fluid and 2 dark slivers. The label read rainwater in careful script. She lifted the jar slightly and peered without stirring the contents. A faint green tide line ringed the glass. Around the lid, a dried crust had formed as neat as a stitched hem. She replaced the jar and stepped back. The inspector appeared in the doorway. He had followed her silence. He saw the jar and set his notebook upon the bench. He unscrewed the lid with a handkerchief and held it to his nose. He made no remark. He closed it again and set it down exactly as it had been. Miss Marple said someone had rinsed leaves in that jar. Later, a different person had used the same jar for something innocent. The two intentions had met briefly in a place called Residue. He agreed and wrote down the word residue as if it were a name. Reverend Clement entered and asked if the jar should be removed. The inspector said not yet. He wished to show it to Dr. Haydock before he claimed it. He wished to learn whether the tide line spoke plainly to a trained eye. A quiet human observation presented itself. Miss Marple noticed a second ladder of light fall across the floor. Dust motes turned slowly in the beam. In that floating trail, she saw a thin scar on the boards, shaped as if a heavy pot had slid and stopped at the threshold. She walked to the door and looked at the sill. A fresh scratch ran across it, bright against the older wood. She said a person had carried something wet and careful. The weight had pulled at the arms. The pot had tipped and righted. The door had left its mark on the rim. She mimed the motion with her hands, small and exact. The Reverend closed his eyes briefly and nodded. He remembered the maid wrestling a washing pot through this very door. He had offered to help and had been waved away with cheerful determination. He had not asked what had been washed. Inspector Hewitt stepped into the yard and studied the path from shed to pump. Small crescent marks pocked the soil, as if a rim had kissed the ground in a few places. He crouched and fitted his hand to the distance between marks. He imagined a cautious person stopping to rest and steady every few steps. Miss Marple looked toward the belladonna corner. She pictured leaves in a pot, steeped as if for soup, then condemned as foolish, then carried toward cleansing. She pictured the path that turned a private mistake into a public harm when it met the pump, the drain, and the soft slope to the ditch. Dr. Haydock returned with a deliberate tread. He examined the jar, sniffed the lid, and nodded. He said the residue smelled as leaves speak when they have been forced. He said the tide line would confirm the nature of the wash. He said the fluid's colour suited that confirmation. The inspector accepted that judgment with quiet gratitude. He asked whether a second pair of hands might have used the same jar for something sweet after it had been rinsed and emptied. The doctor said yes. He said sweetness often followed bitterness when people feared bitterness had lingered. They set the jar back on the shelf and left the shed as they had found it. The garden accepted their movements without complaint. Bees worked the foxgloves. The robin kept its distance and its small pride. Fourth quiet clue. Near the compost heap, Miss Marple found a short length of twine tied in a firm sailor's knot. A tiny smear of red wax stained the knot. She touched it with a fingernail. It flaked under the lightest pressure. The wax had cracked after exposure to sun. She held it up. The inspector considered the stick of sealing wax sold on Monday and the grooved stamp used by the builder. He considered the broker's love of show. He considered a letter never sent and a jar returned on Wednesday. Miss Marple considered something smaller. She considered the sort of hand that tied good knots for no real reason. She considered the way vanity liked small displays of skill. She decided vanity had touched the garden as surely as fear had. They gathered by the bench beneath the pear tree once more. The Reverend asked for counsel. He wished to speak to the village without scolding or stirring. He wished to teach without pointing. He wished to restore the garden's repute as well as the wells. Miss Marple suggested a tea in the garden with open doors and open explanations. She said the inspector might show the cleaned jar and the cleansed drain. She said the doctor might speak of leaves and doses in an everyday voice. She said the Reverend might praise patience more than prudence. The inspector smiled almost fully at that. He said public honesty soothed private fear. He said kindly demonstrations outran tidy rumors. He said people remembered a poured jug better than a posted notice. They settled the plan with simple words. The afternoon drifted toward its mild conclusion. From the gate, Mrs. Weatherby entered with a covered plate. She brought seed cakes and good intention. She apologized for any harm done by her tidying in the vestry. Her eyes carried real regret. Miss Marple thanked her. She took one cake and praised its cinnamon. She asked gently whether Mrs. Weatherby had tied a jar with twine after returning it. The organist looked surprised and then ashamed. She confessed tying it against slippage on the sill. She had used a scrap of wax to pinch the twine flat. The inspector accepted this with a nod. He said tidy hands were not the same as guilty ones. He said reconstruction mattered more than blame. He asked if she would help set chairs for the garden tea. She agreed at once with grateful relief. The sun lowered and warmed the border tops. The foxgloves rang in silence. Miss Marple walked a slow circuit, seeing the garden now as a map of the story. Here leaves had been pulled in haste. Here a pot had rested with its heavy breath. Here a jar had waited between two uses, neither quite erased. She turned to the belladonna corner and considered human soil. Pride grew there. Fear grew there. Thrift and show grew there side by side. The earth did not judge which roots drank deeper. It nourished all alike and left judgment to those who drank. She spoke to the Reverend, very gently. She said he must forgive himself for not knowing a language he had never learned. She said he was learning now. She said learning always looked like humility when done well. He thanked her with a steady voice. He said he would preach a short sermon about knowledge and care. He said he would mention the garden only once and let the cakes do the rest. Inspector Hewitt set his hat under his arm and looked out across the borders. He said the case had taught him a domestic lesson. He said harm often began with the right intention walking down the wrong path. He said his duty was to place new signposts along that path. Dr. Haydock closed his bag. He said medicine and gardening kept close company. He said both labored to balance vigor with restraint. He said he preferred restraint for both. Evening came gently. Lamps brightened behind vicarage curtains. The smell of time deepened as the air cooled. A final blackbird call folded the day shut. The garden exhaled, as if relieved to have spoken its piece. Miss Marple stood near the pumpstone and rested her hand on its cool rim. She felt the place give back steadiness. She felt the story gathering toward its last turn. She knew the remaining truth would come not from leaves, but from the hearts that had used them. She walked to the gate with the inspector. They paused together and looked back at the garden. The foxgloves lifted their bells as if in benediction. The dark corner held its peace without malice. The path shone with honest wear. All poisons, she thought, come from the same soil as kindness. Both rise from hunger and hope. Both borrow familiar vessels and seek familiar roads. The difference is attended by attention itself. She folded that thought away like a clean handkerchief. Then she stepped into the lane, ready for the next small turn of truth. Evening gathered itself around St. Mary Mead with quiet grace. The lamps along the lane glowed like mild intentions. At Miss Marple's cottage the curtains were half drawn, and the teapot steamed on the tray beside 2 cups. Inspector Hewitt stood at the door, hat in hand. His manner carried fatigue, but also something gentler, a sort of settled respect. She invited him in and gestured toward the chair by the hearth. He sat with a sigh that belonged to both weariness and completion. He said the reports were done. The council would close its file tomorrow. The well had been cleansed twice over, the drains sealed. The village would have water again by week's end. He said he should feel content, but contentment still waited somewhere beyond reach. Miss Marple poured the tea with unhurried hands. The china made its soft music. The scent rose like calm thought. She asked what troubled him. He said not the facts, those were tidy now, but the people who lived among them. He said Mrs. Harper had offered to leave the village. He said the builder had paid his debt and gone north. He said the organist kept to herself and played quieter hymns. He said the grocer's boy had found work in market basing under better eyes. Each person had tried to repair something unseen. Miss Marple nodded. She said repair was the truest form of repentance. She said guilt that led to silence rotted, but guilt that led to work could bloom. She handed him a cup. He accepted it with the awkward grace of a man more used to papers than porcelain. The first sip steadied him. He looked into the cup as though reading the story printed on the surface. First quiet clue. Miss Marple noticed his hesitation before the next sip. She smiled faintly. She asked what he saw there. He said reflection, perhaps his own, small and distorted by ripples. She said that reflections always show truth in motion, not truth at rest. He asked whether she believed in closure. She said she believed in understanding, which was gentler and more likely to last. Closure, she said, belonged to files. Understanding belonged to heart. The clock on the mantel marked the hour with an even chime. The sound folded softly into the room. Outside, a dog barked once and stopped. The night prepared itself for the peace it deserved. Miss Marple reached for her notebook and opened it upon the table. The pages held small, neat lines. She turned to the last one. It read, 2 poisons, 1 truth. She looked at the inspector and said quietly that both the physical and the moral poisons had come from the same source, fear disguised as virtue. He listened without interrupting. She spoke with the slow rhythm of someone counting stitches. Fear of debt, fear of blame, fear of untidiness. Each had led a hand astray. A widow's careful nature had poured leaves into a drain. A housekeeper's nervous order had poured residue into the same path. A builder's vanity had burned a letter rather than confess a mistake. None had meant harm, and yet harm had found its way through them all. Second quiet clue. She reached for a small saucer beside the pot. A faint ring marked its rim, a stain too pale to bother with, but too precise to miss. She touched it lightly. She said truth was much the same. It left marks that could not be polished away without dulling the surface altogether. The inspector said the village would settle again. People would speak kindly of Mrs. Harper soon enough. They always did once gossip found a new story. Miss Marple said gossip was not wicked when tempered by memory. It kept lessons alive longer than sermons. He smiled then, properly. He said the doctor had told him the same thing, in a sterner way. He said the doctor had called the well a parish education in chemistry. Miss Marple laughed softly. She said it had been an education in humanity. They drank their tea. The lamplight touched their faces and stayed. The inspector stood and moved to the window. The lane shimmered faintly under the lamps. He said the village looked clean again, yet he wondered how long that cleanliness would last. Miss Marple said until the next bit of vanity found a new shape. "Vanity," she said, "never died. It simply chose a different cup." He turned and looked at her. He asked whether she had known from the beginning that Mrs. Harper had not meant harm. She said yes. She said grief and guilt wear different shoes, and she had heard the difference in the widow's step. Grief drags, guilt hurries. Third, quiet clue. He noticed her teapot lid tilting slightly and reached to straighten it. As he did, he saw a small chip along the spout. Miss Marple said it had been there for years. She had kept the pot all the same because its pour was steady. She said imperfection that serves is better than perfection that breaks at the first use. He said he supposed that was why she lived alone so happily. She smiled. She said she did not live alone. She lived among memories, neighbors, and the curious company of her own thoughts. Solitude, she said, was only loneliness that had learned good manners. The fire whispered in its small voice. The inspector set his cup down and said he envied her calm. She said calm was not a gift, but a habit, like listening before judging. He said he would file the report tomorrow. He would list the causes as accidental contamination through combined neglect. He asked whether that sounded just. She said justice often began with understatement. The village would not understand phrases like moral contagion, but they would understand accident and effort. That was enough. Fourth quiet clue. She poured a little more tea into his cup. The leaves at the bottom of the pot swirled, then stilled. A single leaf floated upright for a moment, its stem pointing toward him. She looked at it with mild interest. She said even tea, when left long enough, tells what it has absorbed. He asked what she saw in the leaf. She said she saw order returning. He laughed, and for the first time that evening, the sound held no weariness. They spoke for a while about small things, the vicarage tea, the doctor's fondness for chess, the choir's plan to plant marigolds near the pump. The conversation became the kind that carries its own warmth, needing no conclusion. At last, the inspector stood. He thanked her for her time and her patience. She said both were free and infinitely renewable, so long as one knitted regularly. He laughed again and took his leave. When the door closed, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The fire had settled to red embers. The clock's tick filled the space between thoughts. She poured herself the final half-cup and watched the curl of steam rise. She thought of all she had seen, of the garden's poisons, the well's water, the letter's ashes, the powdered crusts, and the quiet apologies. She thought of how wrongdoers in her village always returned to the same refuge, routine. The ordinary restored them. It forgave what law could only record. She lifted the cup to her lips. The tea tasted faintly of lemon, the ghost of last week's cordial. She smiled at the irony. She said softly to the air that forgiveness often came disguised as familiarity. She set the cup down, folded her hands, and looked toward the window. The lamps along the lane now blurred into a single glow, like memory smoothing edges. The world outside had resumed its shape. The village, having confessed in its own quiet way, could sleep. She reached for her knitting. The wool waited where she had left it, a promise of order restored. The first stitch came easy, the next easier still. Each loop held patience, each row remembered balance. A log in the hearth sighed as it settled. The flame steadied. The room, like the village, breathed evenly again. Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, that the truth, once poured, cools faster than lies. It must be drunk while still warm. Candlelight Message. And so, dear listener, Miss Marple and the Poison in the Village. Well, a Miss Marple mystery story draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame is steady once more, its light falling softly on truth revealed. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes, each stitch a reflection on the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.